Thank you. Thank you all. I know it's wet and kind of crummy outside. And the whole day I have heard from several people, especially Kathleen, who I'm very, very grateful to, Kathleen Gorman, the one who contacted me and invited me to your campus. I just want to say I'm not tired. I'm really rejuvenated. I'm really excited. I've had a beautiful day. And I'm very grateful to all of you who invited me to your classes, and I've had the opportunity to talk to so many of you. And I think it was Kathleen I was talking to and saying that it really annoys me when I hear people telling our youth, you're leaders of tomorrow. No, you're leaders today. So it's been a wonderful, beautiful day for me being with you all today. I have talked a lot today, so I hope I have something new to tell you. But I just wanted to say it's really heartfelt, your hospitality, the Women's Center for the wonderful, gracious meal, just everything. Thank you so much. One reason that I'm looking tired is not because Kathleen has made me work today, but I just got back from home. I just got back 2 days ago from India. And it's a time difference, and somehow I don't sleep very well when I'm back home, want to live every second while I'm there. But one of the sad things when I was there was looking at the newspapers every day. I was in Hyderabad, which is in Andhra Pradesh, a state in southern part of India. And almost every day when you turn the pages of the newspaper, there would be a report of one farmer consumes pesticide, then another farmer in this village had taken his own life. It was amazing. Every day, 2 or 3 farmers were taking pesticides to end their lives. It was amazing. It was just every day. And it's not the front page news. You turn the newspaper, it's just there. And you kind of just get numb after a while. It becomes a routine. Some farmers kill themselves every day in India. And I thought of June 6th. The New York Times had a story which reported that deaths had driven 50 to 100 farmers to take their own life in Andhra Pradesh. And this was interesting. This had happened since mid-May when a new government had taken office in Andhra Pradesh. And it was also interesting because many of you might have followed elections in India, but India had been boasting of a 10% growth rate. You know, that's a big deal, 10% growth rate. America couldn't say that right now. And the motto of the party, BJP, which was in power, was India shining. Thanks to our leadership, India shining. But the majority of the people who have fallen through the cracks voted that government out of power. And since the formation of the new government, just in those few days, another 50 to 100 farmers had taken their own lives. And this is a trend which has been going on. It is estimated that between 1997 and 2003, an estimated 25,000 farmers have killed themselves in India. Farmers who have been faced with a dead end have opted for death. Facing farm foreclosures, faced with big debts from the bank, they have taken the pesticides that were given to them to increase agricultural production to end their lives. Very often when I talk about India and ask people what they think of it, usually people think of a country with a lot of poverty, a population, for good reason. But at the same time, most people don't realize that I come from a country which is the 3rd largest producer of food in the world. What some of you might know is that it is also home to nearly 350 million people who go to bed hungry. It is a country where almost 80 million children will never attend school. They'll never see the inside of a school. These are children sold into prostitution, into slavery. They work with the parents in the fields. By the way, Indians are not strange. We don't like to oppress our children. It's poverty that our children will not go to school. It's poverty that they'll be working in factories, that they'll be in carpet factories, in match industry, in bangle industry. There's nothing strange about our genes. But anyway, talking about India, I want to move to the United States of America, where I've had the opportunity to live since 1995. Something which always amazes me when I go to different campuses or anywhere talking to people about food and agriculture in the United States. How many of you know that in 1925, 30% of the US population lived on nation's 6 million farms? 30% of the population. And today, 2 million farms are home to only 2% of the population. In fact, there are such few people in farming now that census does not even recognize farming as a profession. So actually, according to the census, farmers are not an endangered species, they are extinct. And it is not surprising given that only 14%, only 14% of the income of a farming household comes from farming. The rest of the income comes from getting a second or a third job, at the local Walmart for below minimum wage or at the local gas station. And in fact, the poorest 50 counties in the country, 49 of those are rural counties. We are starving of food producers. Another interesting fact for you, there are more people behind bars than behind the wheel of a tractor in this country. Who will feed the prison population? And the most shocking fact of all is that the number one cause of death among farmers in the United States of America is suicide. The rate of shame, of depression, alcoholism is really high as farmers see the land which has been in families for generations being taken away as the farms are foreclosed. They make it look like accidents so the family can get some life insurance money. This is the model of agriculture which is being exported to the rest of the world. It did not work for the United States. It will not work for my country. I was invited here to speak in the honors Coloquium, Food and Human Rights, Hunger and Social Policy. And I was thinking, what am I going to talk about? Policy stuff is boring, especially in the evenings. So I thought I'm going to tell you stories. Reagan was really popular, and I've been trying to grapple with it, why he was so popular. You know why? He learned from Hollywood. You need to tell stories. He had great stories. The endings were all wrong, at least different from mine. So I'm going to tell you stories. When we talk about hunger, we have seen this newspaper headline scream of hunger and massive starvation. For example, 2002, you pick up any newspaper, some small daily somewhere. I'm not trying to be, elitist here about New York Times, but you pick up any newspaper, there were reports of starvation in southern Africa. Now that's acute hunger. But then there is another form of hunger which is very invisible. We don't hear much about it. And that is chronic hunger, day in, day out. And that affects nearly 815 million people in the developing world alone. Just want to remind you, out of those 815, my country is home to 350 million people, the third largest producer of food in the world. And the rich countries are no different, thanks to the incredible work that the center is doing. You know the facts and figures for hunger levels in the Rhode Island. But America, the so-called richest nation on earth, according to US Department of Agriculture, over 38 million Americans are hungry. Surely there's no shortage of food production in this country. And over the last 4 years, we have seen these numbers increase. Over 14 million children in this country are food insecure. This is the country with the highest rate of child poverty. Yes, I'm not talking about India, I'm talking about the other homeland that I've made, the United States. 1 in 5 children, in every 5 children is growing up in poverty. And yes, this rarely makes the evening news, but this is pretty deadly. Do you know hunger kills almost 30 to 50 million people a year? This is almost 3 to 4 times more the number of people that were killed annually during the Second World War. But it's not sensational enough. It doesn't make it to the evening news. So all these numbers that I've been throwing at you are kind of staggering, but I believe numbers. We stop thinking. It's like my reaction, turning the newspaper in India, 2 farmers, 3 farmers kill themselves. So I want to start by what is hunger? Who would define it for me? Yeah? Hey, English is not even my native language, and I'm standing here boring you to death. Come on. Yeah, okay.
Not having enough food to subsist on.
Mm-hmm. Not having enough food to subsist on, yeah? Any other definition?
Pain.
Pain? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Not knowing where it's going to come from, yeah, next meal. The left is always so slow. That's the challenge of our times. What is hunger? Yeah, it is that gnawing pain in our stomach. It is that physical depletion that we feel because of undernutrition. But I want to tell you about hunger, which is much more than that. In January 2003, Mexican farm leaders, they went on a strike. They went on a hunger strike. And they were protesting the agricultural provisions of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. And why were they protesting? Because a country which was self-sufficient in grains, thanks to the removal of tariffs, suddenly was exposed to the surplus being dumped from the United States of America. So what is the result of that? 95% of soya, 58% of rice, 49% of wheat, 40% of its meat today comes from US. A country which was self-sufficient in food is today dependent on the United States of America. What is the human impact of that? Every day, 600 farmers, small family farmers who cannot compete against US agribusiness are displaced from their land. Where do they go? They come to America looking for a better life. What do they find? Arrested at the border, death at the border, or slavery in the fields of America. Last year, I was working with Coalition of Immokalee Farm Workers who work in Florida, and they came forward with these cases where there were these farmers from Mexico, Haiti, and Guatemala who have been in this country picking tomatoes in the fields of Florida in the town of Immokalee. They were working 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, and made $20 a week. That's called indentured servitude. So hunger is having to make a choice that nobody should have to. That's what it is. Last year, it's 1 year anniversary of the World Trade Organization Ministerial in Cancun. On the first day, September 10th, there was a big protest. You know, the convention center where the trade negotiators were meeting, and 10 kilometers away were huge big barricades which kept away the indigenous people and farmers who were protesting trade agreements in agriculture. Lee Keng-hei, an old comrade of mine from the Korean Federation, Peasants Federation, climbed up the barricades. He was wearing a sandwich board which read, "WTO kills farmers." He took a knife, stabbed himself in his heart. His farm had foreclosed 4 years ago. His daughter was getting married this week. His dead body went from Cancun. Hunger is oppression. 1998, I had organized a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., when Catherine Engels, a white grandmother, testified before the U.S. Congress, and she said, and those words are etched in my heart, that when it comes to my children, I have no pride. I will scavenge in the bins outside McDonald's and KFC. Sometimes I roll up bread and soak it in tea and have it so I have a sense of a complete stomach. Hunger is denial of dignity. The challenge that we face today, I believe, is to question and ask the Wall Street, what is the business case for this worldwide endemic poverty and hunger? That is the challenge. We need to ask the Wall Street to explain to us. How come have we created a world, an economic system that tells us that it is easier to exploit this planet and humanity than to nurture it? How come the war on terrorism has created even more insecurity rather than making us feel secure? And the question for humanity is, if we are one humanity, how do we live in two worlds instead of one? The problem is that today most of the world's governments and the world's economy are under the control of corporations. So as corporations increase their control, I find the world is getting out of control. In the Lexus and Olive Tree, Thomas Friedman, you might have read his columns in the New York Times, an ardent advocate of globalization, writes, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley technologies to flourish is called the US Army, Air Force, Navy, and the Marine Corps." Yeah, it is the new policy of open markets or open fire. Operation Iraqi Freedom was the same philosophy. Now, some would tell me that it is too simplistic to say that invasion of Iraq was about oil. They're right, it is too simplistic. The invasion of Iraq was about oil, about ports, about trains, about roads, about school textbooks. It's about drugs. Today, Iraq is the most sold country on earth. Freedom for Iraq was really the freedom for corporations to design a dream economy, fully privatized and foreign-owned. So it is the new foreign policy, bomb before you buy. And then there is a war at home. In the last 4 years, Americans have been pushed into poverty like never before, and the ones without health insurance have reached record high. Bush administration has a great technique now. They're trying to change data collection methods so it can have favorable numbers before the elections. His father did the same. Near the elections, he had discontinued to release the government's monthly job loss reports when he was in the office because you need to have the economy look good. Now we're going to share some truth with you. In some of the classes, I've talked a lot about the third world debt. Do you know what the debt figure for this country is, the national debt? $475 million? The national debt clock marks America's outstanding national debt at over $7 trillion. $7 trillion, which makes every citizen's share to be over $25,000. And since September 2003, this debt is increasing by $1.72 billion each day. The number you mentioned is for the national deficit. The deficit, and in fact, it is so bad that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, which has put structural adjustment programs on third world countries because of their bad deficits, has alerted US that you better watch out, that US might be put on structural adjustment programs. When Bush came to office, there was a surplus of $236 billion. Where did the surplus go? In August, the administration said, we have some good news. Our deficit is only $445 billion. Now, it is only in the backward economics of this administration that you can call a deficit of $445 billion good news, because initially they had said it's going to be over $500 billion. Since it is not over $500 billion, this is good news. Never mind, it is $70 billion more than the previous year. You might say, why should I care about these figures? But we need to. Who pays for it? We do. Our schools do. Our communities do. In August, Bush signed a $400 billion spending bill that will go to military efforts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in strengthening the missile defense program. We have already spent $151 billion on this war in Iraq. It is 3 times more than what we were told. The US today spends more than half of the world's military spending. So US spends as much on military as the rest of the world does. And I don't feel secure. Have you noticed those terror alerts recently? Military spending has increased from $296 billion in '97 to $379 billion in 2003. We are spending more than $1 billion a day in dropping bombs on innocent civilians. And if you look at the projected budget for 2005, they plan to spend what would amount to $11,000 a second, $11,000 a second on defense. Now compare that with the figures when it comes to spending on children, on our communities, on providing housing. providing real aid to third world countries, nil. At the same time, poverty has been increasing. Over 36 million Americans today live in poverty. The number of children living in poverty has reached a decade high. The number of uninsured Americans is over 45 million Americans do not have health insurance. Since Bush took office, over 1 million jobs have been lost, which is the only administration to see a net job loss since the 1930s depression. Home foreclosures have jumped 50%, and Bush budget plans till 2009 put every good program that we have had, which have been fought for, on the chopping block, whether it is adult literacy programs, adult training and vocational schools, federally subsidized child care programs so single moms can go out and work. All those programs are being eliminated, such as housing aid for Native Americans. Anything decent and good, this administration has put it on the chopping block. The world is waiting for answers. We need answers. And I'm sharing these facts and figures or these stories with you because somewhere deep down, you and I both know it, that we know how to transform this world. We know it. We know how to provide jobs with dignity and living wage jobs to all. We know how to ensure that we can feed and clothe and shelter every human being in this world. The challenge is to figure out how we're going to remove those in power whose policies have caused this hunger and poverty. That is the challenge before us. And I would suggest that the way to do that is to focus on people, and especially those who pay the highest price: women, children, communities of color, the localized poor. During the day, and often I get this, God, isn't it really hard? These times are so bad. Aren't you pessimistic? You know, Helen Keller once said, this is the time for a loud voice, open speech, and fearless thinking. I rejoice that I live in such a splendidly disturbing time. I think we live in those times again, the times which require and demand a new human rights movement. It was very touching for me being a citizen of another country and to be in New York City at the time of the Republican National Convention. 500,000 Americans and people of other nations marched. It was incredible to see that despite the same preemptive policy that the New York police adopted of arresting people, these were peaceful protests. They were arresting protesters, but there was no deterring them. They continued to march in the streets. These were the people who were talking about the war in Iraq and war overseas and war at home. For example, the Poor People's March. They marched on from Philadelphia to set up Bushville and demanded what happened to their basic rights. Or you think of all the homeless groups in New York that came together to say, still we rise, that despite violations of our basic human rights or civil liberties, we march on to New York, still we rise. I think this is a time to dream. We know dreams for a sustainable future are not going to come from Bush and Cheney. So I have started dreaming. I dream. When I hear of elections in Venezuela and how Jimmy Carter goes there, I dream of international monitors monitoring our next elections. I dream of every country respecting human rights treaties. For example, United States, which is the only other country other than Somalia which has not ratified the rights of the child, that this country will ratify it. I dream that United States of America will sign on to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights instead of saying that if we respect the right to food, then welfare reform is in violation of it. I dream of a government with a plan to eliminate poverty, a plan where no child anywhere will go to bed hungry. I dream when we will reclaim our country, whether it's India or it's the United States of America. I dream when we can reclaim a democracy to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, instead of a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. I dream that instead of us thinking about a corporate America, we can think of a humane America. And as Eduardo Galeano said, I dream about a time when the world will no longer be at war against the poor, but against poverty. When the weapons industry will declare bankruptcy. Street children will no longer be treated as trash because there will be none. It sounds good, but these dreams require that we act politically. You know, the left, sorry, not singling you out, the left, we have great ideas, but the right wing does the politics. We are very comfortable in our positions. We are very comfortable that we have the higher moral ground, but they have the power. We are excited about being right, but they are the ones in control. We need to get involved. We can no longer pretend that we are shielded. We can no longer pretend that Iraq is the other. We can no longer do that. It is at our doorstep. It is right here in our backyard. And there is hope. A lot of people feel there is no hope. And I always remind people there is hope because we have not quit. And we have not quit because there is hope. I mean, let's not forget, even the New York Times was forced to acknowledge after the fact when millions of people marched around the world against the war to say there are two superpowers in the world today. One is the United States, the other is the civil society. There is Via Campesina, the world's largest small farmers movement that has come together to challenge liberalization of trade and agriculture to say, this is about food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right of every country and people to decide how to grow food in ways which are ecologically, socially, and economically appropriate for them. One of my favorite Sufi poets is Hafiz, and he once wrote, "Clever men place the world into cages, but the wise saint who must duck her head under the moon throws keys to the rowdy prisoners." Let's throw keys to the rowdy prisoners. Being political and being involved is right now getting the vote out. And it is a challenge for every American because if you put Bush back in that office, you have to let every citizen of this world vote because your president has a say and has an impact on what happens around the world. So if we are complacent, I hear often when people say, God, he's going to be elected again. If that's going to happen, then we demand a right to vote in this country's elections. Being political is questioning the economy. Being political is questioning the treatment that is being meted out to immigrants at the borders, the treatment that is being meted out to prisoners in Iraqi prisons, being meted out to prisoners, the prison population in the United States. Being political is to demand how come we have bombs and no money for our books. Being political is letting the world know that there is no need to hate the Americans, that the Americans march with the rest of the world for global justice. And letting people know that there is a global South right here as well. There is oppression right here in the United States as well. And I would end by sharing another of my favorite quotes because I talked about fear. I think what immobilizes us, that we cannot move, whether it is hunger. I hope you got that when I was talking. Hunger is something that we can solve. It is a result of man-made decisions. That's the good news. We can change those decisions. When we think about conflict, we know how to resolve that. What stops us is this culture of fear. It's almost like this brain lobotomy that we have gone through, especially since September 11th. That we can change that. And Hafiz once said, fear is the cheapest room in the house. Fear is the cheapest room in the house. My dear, you deserve better living conditions. And we do. We deserve better living conditions. And often, while working in Geneva and with trade negotiators, people will tell me, your passion is so great, it is so wonderful, but it is not realistic. I think it's time we remind ourselves. Civil rights movement was told that ending segregation was a good idea, but not realistic. Women's rights movement was told that the right to vote was a good idea, but not possible. And as Cesar Chavez said, is it possible? Can we do it? Si se puede. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question, and I'd like to know, in your view, is biotech products that are being used in third world countries, do you think that they're just an alternative for just to provide excess food as we have it here in the United States? Thank you.
Biotechnology, its benefits for the third world. Well, usually when you hear about biotechnology, you look at the advertisements run by Monsanto, they'll say, guess who's coming to dinner, this is going to be the population in so many years, so we need biotechnology to feed the world. First of all, biotechnology is not new. As I've said in some classrooms, making beer, making yogurt is biotechnology. What we are really talking about is genetic engineering and transgenic crops. So if we fall into that myth, what we are believing is that we have hunger because there's shortage of food production. Now, we have enough food to provide over 4.5 pounds of food per person per day around the world. The reason you have hunger is not the shortage of food production, it is a shortage of purchasing power. What people need is not biotechnology or genetic engineering. They need living wage jobs. They need land. They need, things which would actually empower them, that they can buy food or have control over food producing resources. In terms of third world, well, if you look at what is being genetically engineered right now, it's mainly corn, cotton, canola, and soya. Only 4 crops. And so most of the times when you hear about vitamin-rich sweet potato for Africa or vitamin A rice, they have all failed. So that's what I call poor washing by by promoters of genetic engineering, and we have to look at the real reasons why they're so keen to do that. Are you really going to trust Monsanto, which gave you Agent Orange, bovine growth hormone, and now they come up with Roundup Ready crops? Monsanto responsible for release of 90% of genetically engineered crops in the world? I don't think so. So in terms of the third world, it is very interesting if you see what the response has been there. 2002, when US tried to send genetically modified food aid to Zambia, and Zambia refused, Tony Hall, US representative to the United Nations, went completely crazy. He was like, thousands will die in Zambia, and this country should be taken before the International Criminal Court for crime against humanity. I mean, his PR people didn't even tell him US does not believe in the International Criminal Court. So if you look at the resistance, just today I got the news, Costa Rica has had its own sessions, and finally Monsanto was wanting to release GM corn in Costa Rica. They had to leave the country. Third world doesn't want it. We do not want US-based corporations to tell us what's good for us. Africans, Asians, Latin Americans can actually think for themselves.
How would you propose to educate people about the power that they have, about the ability that they have to change things, when a lot of the same corporations who own some of these companies that are creating the problem also own the companies that are in charge of telling us about the problem, the media, and the media is thus kind of unavailable for that education effort? How do you actually get this out to people?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Yeah, so how are we going to do it? It's been pretty impressive if you look at some of the human rights movements. I mean, you look at liberation theology, people going from village to village. We will have to get resourceful. On one hand, we have corporate media, what's called the mainstream media, and then there's the independent media. And it's been amazing what you can find on the internet. But it's really about getting involved. It's amazing what one person can do when you go and walk into your church or your mosque or your temple, wherever, the power of being able to share the information. It pretty much spreads like wildfire. There's a lot we can do there. In terms of media also, I have to say a part of me, I was pretty amazed, for example, when the reports, New York Times and others every newspaper was full of what happened in the prisons in Iraq. So if you really want to find the information, it's there. It's about creating a culture where we care, where it's not just the other, it's not happening to the other, but we care. And that is up to each one of us. Very often talking about hunger, people feel that, Africa is so far away, what can I do? India is so far away. We can get involved in our own community. It is amazing what we can do when we get involved with a food bank, just the knowledge of how many people are food insecure. what happens in our curriculums in our colleges. And increasingly, I mean, the fact I'm in your campus, and I'm just one of many people who come by here. So that world is opening up, and each one of us has a task to spread the word, to share that information and share those resources. On one hand, yes, you have media consolidation, and then you have common dreams, you have alternate, you have all these amazing sources of information. Thank God for Al Jazeera.
My question kind of relates directly to the first one. I agree with two things that you said, that there's definitely enough food in the world to feed everybody, and that third world people can think for themselves. I also think that a lot of third world countries have some of the richest in natural resources in a lot of cases. Do you think the answer for some of them to the question of food sovereignty is to try to close their borders to international business and maybe nationalize as much as they can?
Another good question. You have a great campus. First of all, a lot of people, especially in Seattle, all of us were painted as people with, bandanas and the rest. Not that there's anything wrong with it, and globophobes and anti-globalization. I'm not anti-anything. I'll tell you what I'm for. I'm pro-development, pro-immigrant rights, pro-women's rights, pro-human rights, pro-workers' rights. I'm one person who's pro a lot of things. And I'm not anti-trade. Commerce has always happened. One of my biggest ongoing debates with my friends from Mexico is, Indians say we invented zero, and those Mexicans say they invented zero. God alone knows who really invented it. It was the trade relations and the trade that has always happened. So trade is not new. What we are against and saying is this race to the bottom. Case of agriculture. Agriculture and food is about feeding our families and communities. Third world is not an exotic fruit basket to meet the needs of Western consumers. We want to grow food for our families and communities. And it is very interesting, United States of America did not want to trade in agriculture till '94. It followed the most protectionist policies till it was ready with its subsidies, and subsidies dismantled in the third world to say, let's talk free trade. The kind of monopolies you have, for example, only 2 grain companies control over 80% of the grain production, Cargill and Continental. That breaches the policies of free trade. So it is challenging that kind of trade, which is a race to the bottom and just capturing free trade markets. So in terms of food sovereignty, it's not saying that farmers don't want markets. Farmers want markets, but we have to first focus on local and regional markets. 90% of the market with 1 billion people in my country for the farmers in India is within India. Instead of trying to let go of that market and try to make it international where the commodity prices are going down, it makes no sense. It's like, again, backward economics. So what one is proposing, especially when it comes to agriculture, is that if you look at any model, you look at the Asian tigers. Why were they called the Asian tigers? Because there was strong state intervention. In the name of free trade, when you start getting rid of state intervention to make sure that the poor and the marginalized don't fall off the face of this earth, it's not a good trade model. And for agriculture, definitely trade agreements out of agriculture.
I was just trying to figure out how is it that you had said that the farming industry is getting very small in America, correct? So how is it that American farms are exporting so much all over the world?
Agribusiness. We have seen a complete shift where farmers have been replaced by agribusiness, big companies, where our farmers are being replaced by machines, where our diversity of crops is being replaced by monocultures. And that is why, if you see, there are strong pockets of production in few crops that we call commodities: cotton, corn, sugarcane, soya, canola. So it is about the shift and that's called industrial agriculture, where you have small family farming being replaced by a whole different corporate industrial farm.
Hi. I've read a little about microcredit and the positive effect it's had on individuals in impoverished communities. And I was wondering, in your opinion, if there's a downside to microcredit at all.
Well, people need a lot of things. On one hand, you need land, you need access to credit, so microcredit schemes are great. For example, in India, you have SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association, which was basically rag pickers, people who go in the street and collect rags, anything they find on the street, and then try to sell it, and they weren't unionized. So the concept was, first of all, to bring dignity into what they do. Instead of being called a rag picker, you were a self-employed woman. And they're mainly women and children who do that. And from that point of empowerment, the credit scheme came later. The credit scheme came later where women were at a whole different level. I believe if you look at the women in the US through microcredit schemes, it can provide a lot of support, and it can provide that big boost that you do need.
How often do countries receive food aid, mostly consisting of food that they cannot or will not eat for different reasons?
Good question. If you look at food aid, if you look at the history of food aid, it's always been used as a political weapon, unfortunately. It's always been given when the country in need would basically agree to the political ideology that was coming from Washington, D.C., or would agree to what people call the Washington Consensus. Most times, almost every time, it goes in late. I'm not saying there should be no food aid. There are times when you need food aid, and it needs to be provided right away. Usually it does not happen. The latest case right now is that of Sudan. It's gone in too late when thousands of people have already perished. Two, as you mentioned, though World Food Program has a policy that it should be food which is acceptable to people, we have seen over and over again food being forced upon countries that they don't want. Like in 2002, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Zambia, everyone was saying no to genetically modified food aid from US, and US was like, that's all you're gonna get. Or in 98, I was in Indonesia on a fact-finding mission because this country, which was given a gold medal by FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, for achieving food self-sufficiency, was suddenly the largest recipient of food aid in the world. And actually, when I was there, I found there was no shortage of food. The problem was the Asian financial crisis, when every single day, almost 15,000 people were losing their jobs in Jakarta alone. People were too poor. And what did US and Australia send in? Wheat. Indonesians don't eat that. So it happens over and over again. It is not procured locally from the farmers, so it will help boost the economy. It all comes in from US or Canada or Australia, further subsidizing the agribusiness in those countries.
Hi. I sort of have a multifaceted question here. Now that all these LDCs are spiraling into debt crisis with the unholy trinity, I love that, I must say. How are we going to deliver basic human rights? Do we do it by debt forgiveness, or, because I doubt that the world's going to be very, going to want to do that. How are we going to do that?
Good question. How are we going to do that? Well, third world countries have been in this debt for a long time. And I think it's not time for debt forgiveness. If you look at the service payments, we have paid the debt over and over again. It's time for reparations, time for payback, really. So it's not about forgiveness, it's about acknowledgement that we have stolen and plundered from the third world over and over again, and it's time to actually return some of what we have stolen. There are all kind of campaigns. There's Jubilee South campaign, which is asking for the annulment of these bad loans. There is 50 Years is Enough campaign, which has been demanding annulment of bad loans. These are, again, debts, as most of you know, for projects that people did not want, for projects which have not benefited the communities, which have supported dictatorships. So honestly, I think we don't need to pay them back. I mean, in the 70s, that was the new world order that the third world was trying to create, when some of the countries, such as Mexico and Brazil, had talked about defaulting on their loans, and we saw what happened. We saw how the Wall Street went crazy. There were reports from all these banks saying this will be a financial disaster for the whole world. We saw governments toppling. The United States moved in. Perhaps it was the wrong time. We live in different times now. I mean, look at Latin America. Bolivia people have changed the government, the indigenous people, when they didn't agree with it. There is Lula Light, but there is a former steel factory worker, president of Brazil, so times might have changed. But what has really changed is not just the decision makers. I think the social movements have never been so alive and so vibrant as they are today. You look at the movement of landless workers in Brazil, you look at Via Campesina around the world, you look at poor people's campaigns in the United States, you look at anti-privatization forum in South Africa. So I think this is not up to the will of decision makers that they'll forgive the debts. There is a famous Nigerian saying that if you will not share your wealth with us, we will share our poverty with you. So I think time will tell.
You discussed how all of us have the power to vote and to try to change who's in power. What I wanted to ask you about is, I've done a lot of thinking about another method through which we all have power other than voting, which is just voting with our dollars, trying not to buy the food from the agribusiness corporations, but instead to buy food from our local farmers, to work locally to create more extensive market structures and preserve farmland so that we can have local food systems with independent farmers. I was just wondering, do you see that also as being a powerful method through which we can affect change?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, there are lots of different ways to be active. I was trying to be respectful of the time that I had said to Lynn that I would stick to while speaking, but definitely there are lots of ways. We can vote with our dollars, the choice that we make. Food is something so political. Every time you reach out in the market shelf and pick out something, you're making a political choice about what is grown, how it is grown, and who gets to eat it. And I always say organic food is so cheap in my country because people who grow organic food are the poor peasants who don't have the money to put all that crap in the soil. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can grow. I mean, you look at, and it's a growing movement. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States of America, the organic food movement. And we need to take it back from the Safeways and stuff. We've put this little corner with organic foods because they see it's a lifestyle. This is not a lifestyle. This is about the human right to food. We all have the right to decent, nutritious meals. Farmers markets, I mean, in California, they're everywhere. They're in, inner city areas. They're accepting food stamps and big coupons. That didn't happen overnight. We all struggled for it. I remember 95, 96, our battles to make sure they could do that. The CSA movement, I mean, in Oakland, we have People's Grocery, which is amazing. They have converted this 2-acre lot in West Oakland, in inner city area, riddled with violence and incarceration of the youth there. They've taken over this vacant lot and they grow this organic food, which is provided at really cheap, affordable rates. And this, the transportation is so bad, people can't go to the shops, so there is this bus, a mobile market, which runs on biodiesel, which goes through the inner city areas, providing this food. So there are different ways that we can exercise our power and reclaim. But it is about getting creative. And, Zapatistas say that there is possibility of many worlds in one world. So I'm not going to give you one thing that you can do. I don't want to be like World Bank, one size fits all. Get creative, get involved in your communities. The answers are right there.
How can citizens of the United States like us learn to recognize dishonest international hunger efforts? And how should we be convincing our policymakers to establish effective and equitable solutions? Like, what should we be writing to our policy efforts? And how should we be convincing them to combat hunger in honest and helpful ways?
As long as policymakers of this country do not respect human rights of Americans, they will never care for the Indians, Mexicans, Filipinos. They don't care if they don't care for their own people. So I think the battle really starts right here at home. And we have a lot of power. Whether it is knowing that I can lift the phone and call my congressional representative, calling my senator, it has a lot of impact. They are the ones who have to care because after all they have temporary jobs. We can change them, we can replace them. So we can do that. When you see the newspapers, the way they're reporting, you're not happy about it? Bring your group together, demand a meeting with the editorial board, write a letter to the editor. Make noise. Making noise is good. You know, it's, how do you say it in English? It's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil? Yeah.
Hi. I appreciate your encouragement to focus on local alternatives and to support farmers markets. I'm currently working with children in the city, teaching them how to grow food, and I'm finding that one of the most difficult things for me to figure out concrete ways that I can be part of a movement for community food security is these like public-private partnerships that are long-term contracts. In the public schools in Providence, there's a contract with Sodexo that someone in the administration can't just change like that. You know, Coca-Cola in India, it's all over the place. I'm just wondering, what are some concrete ways to deal with something as big as that? I mean, I can create alternatives like a school garden, but there's never going to be a local tomato in the cafeteria.
Why not?
Because of this contract, they have to order the exact food that Sodexo
Hey, you know
orders.
what? What are laws? Laws are what we make them to be. And I'm always amused when people tell me, like in New York, this cop walked up and said, this is not legal, you know, marching with a sign on the road. I was like, oh, really? Since when? If you have thousands of people on the streets, you know, that what becomes a law. If 1,000 people decide to march down with a banner or with a sign, that becomes the law. In case of India, you mentioned Coca-Cola in India, you know, people in Kerala kick Coca-Cola out. If people in India could, in villages in Kerala, we sure can. Contract is not sacred. For too long, we have been following this personhood of corporations. It's a legal entity. It has personhood. It has rights, which are far superior than our rights. And I think it is about changing a paradigm. You know, a colleague of mine, Vandana Shiva, calls enclosures of a mind. We have started believing that. We've got to change that. I mean, cafeteria, this is our university, you should say. We make it run, we pay the fees. You look at the state universities, UC Berkeley, UC system, less than 30% of funding comes from the state. How come the corporations took it over? The students, you are the driving force of this university. You are the ones who keep the gates open. If you were not there, there wouldn't be no lights on, and I wouldn't be here. So,
Can you
are
give
you going
some, sorry.
So yeah, so
Can you
it's
give
about
some
how do you get
steps?
involved with the cafeteria. I would first of all find out who is, with, you know, contract, who is responsible for it in the administration. Sign up a petition, get people to sign it. I would create a strategic alliance. I'll put some doctors in it. I'll make sure there's some professors in it. All the different departments, a lot of student bodies send a nice letter with a long list of signatures saying, we got a little issue going here. This is our cafeteria and we want to change the food that we get here. That's just one basic step. They'll come back with another letter. It's not possible. And you work out how to make that possible. You give them the list of the local farmers who can provide the food, the CSAs. So you do your homework, you got your business plan right there. And it's good for the local economy.
Thanks.